4 men appeared before the king, leveling an outrageous and scandalous accusation that a woman had been satisfying her desires with a dog. The king, enraged and appalled, immediately summoned the woman to the court. When confronted, the woman denied the allegations, swearing that she had not exposed her honor to any man in 2 years. Unconvinced, the king ordered the royal midwife to examine her, setting the stage for an event that would send shockwaves through the court. The royal midwife entered the chambers with a grave expression, her demeanor reflecting the seriousness of the task ahead. Carefully, she prepared to examine the woman, who was visibly trembling. As the midwife began, the woman cried out, "What is happening?" Her voice was shaking with fear. The midwife responded firmly, "This is necessary to prove your innocence." The woman lowered her gaze and said, "By God, I have shown my honor to no one. These accusations are lies." But the midwife pressed on, continuing the examination. Moments later, the midwife looked at the woman's body intently, her expression darkening. Turning to the king, she declared, "Your Majesty, this woman is lying. There are marks on her body suggesting that she has been involved in indecent acts with an animal." A heavy silence fell over the court. The king's face reflected a mixture of anger and curiosity as he listened to the midwife's report. He glared at the woman and demanded, "So you didn't tell the truth? Are these allegations true?" The woman's condition worsened. Her eyes were darting nervously, yet she insisted, "Your Majesty, I am not lying. These accusations are completely false." The king took a deep breath, his anger mounting. "If this is false, why are you so terrified? Why is your voice trembling?" With trembling hands, the woman replied, "The marks on my body are not from a dog. They are from a man." Her voice was weak, and her words sent a shockwave through the court. "And who is this man?" the king asked sternly, his piercing gaze intent on uncovering the truth. Sweating profusely, the woman hesitated before confessing, "The man, he is here in this very court. He is one of those who brought this accusation against me. He is the one who did this to me." The court was thrown into chaos once again. All eyes turned to the accusers, and the king's rage intensified. He immediately ordered the 4 men who had brought the complaint to step forward. The 4 men were brought into the court. They avoided each other's gaze, their fear evident. The king's eyes burned with anger as he addressed them. "Did you falsely accuse this woman?" For a moment, there was silence. Finally, one of the men hesitated and then spoke quietly. "Your Majesty, we did nothing wrong. We received these allegations from someone else." The king's face turned red with fury. "What? You accused her of such a heinous act based on someone else's word? Who is this person?" The men exchanged uneasy glances, but said nothing. The king's piercing stare made it clear that no one could hide the truth for long. Finally, one of the men mustered the courage to speak. "Your Majesty, the person who told us is here in the court, but we do not know him well. All we know is that he was connected to this woman's life and deceived us into making these accusations." The king's rage boiled over. Rising from his throne, he commanded, "Bring that man before me immediately." Moments later, the court doors opened, and a man was ushered in. His face was pale with fear, and he could barely summon the courage to take a step forward. The king's fiery gaze bore into him. "Are you the one responsible for all of this?" the king demanded. The court fell into an eerie silence, every eye fixed on the trembling figure before them. One day, the king's court was in full swing, resplendent with its usual grandeur. All the courtiers were keenly observing the king's decisions, as people often traveled from far and wide to witness his judgments. His wisdom and understanding were unparalleled, making his court famous throughout the land. His reputation was one of a kind. Just as the king concluded a case involving a woman and was about to adjourn for the day, 4 men suddenly entered the court. Seeing the 4 men approach, the king resumed his seat, postponing the court's adjournment, and directed his attention toward them. The men bowed respectfully to the king and began presenting their case. The first man, standing at the front of the line, spoke up. "Your Majesty, may I have your permission to present a grave issue before you?" The king nodded, granting him permission. The man began, "Your Majesty, there is a woman in our village who appears pious on the outside, but in reality, she is nothing but a disgrace. Initially, she engaged in immoral acts with men, but now she has crossed all limits. She has begun fulfilling her desires, not with men, but with animals. She owns a dog and uses it to satisfy her sinful cravings. This woman deserves to be punished severely. She should be tied to a tree in the village square and stoned to death." The entire court was stunned by his accusations. Even the king's demeanor reflected disbelief and shock. Rising from his throne, the king glared at the man and thundered, "Do you know where you stand and what you are saying? Or have you forgotten that this is the royal court, where every word spoken must be true? If there is even the slightest falsehood in your claim, you cannot begin to imagine the consequences you will face." No sooner had the king spoken than the other three men nodded in agreement with the first and began to speak. "Your Majesty, this man is absolutely correct. The woman is immoral, and now she commits these acts with her dog. If you doubt us, summon her here or ask anyone in the village about her." Why would we lie? The confidence with which the men spoke disturbed the king greatly. He immediately ordered his guards to bring the woman to the court so the truth could be determined. The king never believed in one-sided accusations. He always sought the truth by hearing both sides before passing judgment. However, the flicker of unease that passed over the faces of the four men did not escape the king's sharp eyes. The guards left to summon the woman. A heavy silence fell over the court, a stark contrast to the earlier cheers, praising the king's fairness and wisdom. This case was far more complex than usual, and everyone present was eager to see how it would unfold. In no time, the king's orders were carried out, and the accused woman was brought to court. Draped in a white veil, she stood silently before the king, her face hidden. As she entered, murmurs spread through the crowd. People began speculating and whispering about her alleged deeds. The king looked at her intently, surprised that such a seemingly pure and modest woman could be capable of such acts. Addressing her, the king said, "O woman, a grave complaint has been brought against you. These men accuse you of committing indecent acts with your dog. They claim you are immoral and that you have defied the laws of this kingdom. Are you not aware that such acts are forbidden in my kingdom? Anyone found guilty of such deeds, whether man or woman, faces 10 years of imprisonment. Do you not know this?" Hearing this, the woman broke into uncontrollable sobs. The king, puzzled by her reaction, could not understand why she was crying instead of responding. He watched her silently for a few moments, but her tears did not cease. Finally, the king rose from his throne and ordered a guard to summon the royal midwife to conduct a thorough examination of the woman. "My court does not base its judgments on unverified claims," the king declared. "The truth must be brought to light, so we may determine who is truthful and who is lying." The guards promptly obeyed, and shortly afterward, the royal midwife entered the court accompanied by a soldier. The king explained the situation to her and sent the accused woman to the palace chambers for a detailed examination. The court remained silent as everyone waited anxiously for the midwife's report. The king's sharp gaze lingered on the four men, observing them closely. Their expressions betrayed unease under the intensity of the king's scrutiny. The four men stood silently in the court, their heads bowed. Before they could say anything, the royal midwife came rushing out of the chamber, screaming. Her cries sent shockwaves through the court, and the king rose abruptly from his throne. The midwife appeared visibly shaken, as though she had uncovered a truth she wished to share but couldn't express it in the presence of so many people. The king glanced at the four men, who were watching the midwife with fearful eyes, and signaled for her to remain silent. He then sent her back inside the palace and followed her. The court once again erupted into murmurs. People speculated about the woman, some hurling insults while others defended her character. No one could yet reach a conclusion, and the atmosphere was tense. After some time, the king emerged from the palace, his face bearing a grim expression that sent a chill through the court. Behind him walked the woman, still wrapped in her white veil. Her demeanor, however, had changed. Her eyes now held confidence, and her steps exuded fearlessness. The king silently returned to his throne and sat down. He fixed his piercing, angry gaze on the four men, who stood with their heads lowered. Then, in a thunderous voice, he ordered, For now, the first man will remain here. The rest of you three, leave the court. My guards will summon you when needed." The four men exchanged nervous glances before quietly leaving the court. The king then turned to the first man and said, "You claim there is a dog in this woman's house, and that this woman engages in vile acts with that dog. Surely, if you make such an accusation, you must have seen this with your own eyes. Tell me, what color is the dog?" The man froze, a shadow of fear crossing his face. The courtiers stared at him intently, their curiosity mounting. The king waited for his response, his penetrating gaze locked on the man. When the man failed to answer, the king repeated his question, his voice firmer this time. "Speak! What color is the dog?" Stammering, the man finally replied, "Your Majesty, the dog is white." The king nodded thoughtfully and dismissed him, ordering the second man to enter. When asked the same question, the second man confidently claimed, "The dog is sandy-colored." Once again, the king nodded and dismissed him. By now, the courtiers were watching the king with puzzled expressions, unsure of his intentions. The third man was brought in and asked the same question. He declared that the dog was maroon in color. Finally, the fourth man was summoned, and he stated, "The dog is black." The king listened silently and then ordered his guards, "Bring the dog that lives in this woman's house to the court." His command was promptly carried out, and the four men were brought back into the court and made to stand in a line. Shortly after, the guards returned with the dog. The court fell silent as the animal entered. To everyone's astonishment, the dog was not white, sandy, maroon, or black. Instead, it bore a mix of colors, as though nature itself had painted it with every hue imaginable. The sight of the dog made the four men tremble visibly, their faces betraying their fear. It was clear their falsehood had been exposed. The king turned his gaze toward the woman, who looked back at him with eyes full of gratitude. Her expression spoke volumes, silently thanking the king for seeking the truth and granting her justice. The king then turned to the woman and asked, "You claim you have not committed any wrongdoing with this dog. Then tell me, why are these four men accusing you of such a heinous act?" The woman, her voice trembling with emotion, replied, "Your Majesty, I have done no harm to anyone. I live quietly in my home, away from the world. I do not meet with strangers, nor do I speak to any men. Yet these four men have made it their mission to ruin my life. I cannot understand what I have done to deserve this cruelty. I am a woman already burdened with sorrow. My husband passed away just a year after our marriage, and since then, people have taken advantage of my vulnerability. I rarely step out of my home, but even then, people hurl remarks and accusations at me. I always knew that living alone in this world would be difficult. I have no brother, no father, and now, no husband to protect me. So I turn to God for solace. I spend my time in prayer, sharing my burdens with my Creator. My home is lonely, but I have never taken a wrong step or done anything sinful. Over time, some people began to respect my piety and stopped exploiting my vulnerability. But as always, there are those who cannot let a widow live in peace, and among them are these four men. Your Majesty, during my husband's life, I never had to step outside. He took care of everything while I stayed home, looked after him, and managed the household. But after his death from a dreadful illness, I confined myself to my home out of grief. Eventually, when I needed essential items, I had no choice but to step outside. Even then, I was extremely mindful of maintaining my modesty and veiling myself as commanded by Allah in the Quran. I ensured that I was covered whenever I went out. Some people looked at me with respect, while others stared with lustful eyes. But I never paid attention to anyone and quietly went about my business before returning home. One day, while I was out running an errand, I saw a small, injured puppy lying on the road in a terrible state. I couldn't ignore it, so I brought it home to care for it. Within a few days, it recovered completely and became very attached to me. It had grown so fond of me that I couldn't bring myself to let it go. I am a devout woman, Your Majesty, and even this dog has never entered my prayer area. Considering all this, I decided to keep it in my home. Like me, the dog also became accustomed to staying indoors. I never showed it to the world or brought it outside. I kept it quietly in my house as the days passed. One day, however, a man came to my door and said he wanted to spend time with me. His words terrified me because I had no idea what his intentions were. The woman continued, I told him to leave from my doorstep, saying, "This is not a brothel where you can come to fulfill your desires." Despite his pleas, I refused to entertain him. Your Majesty, I did not see his face, but I am certain he is one of these 4 men standing here today. The next day, another man came to my door, knocking persistently. He said the same things, inviting me to commit a sin, claiming he had fallen in love with me and wanted to spend time with me. He even offered me wealth in exchange. Confused and terrified, I replied loudly, "If you truly love me, then marry me, but I will never commit an immoral act." At this, the man hesitated and responded, "I have no issue marrying you, but I already have 4 wives. They brought significant wealth as dowries, and marrying you would bring problems into my life. However, I am willing to give you plenty of money if you agree to my terms, though I cannot marry you." When I heard this, I firmly rejected him and sent him away. From that day on, I became fearful of even stepping outside my home. I would cry to Allah, seeking His divine help to free me from these men's harassment. But things only worsened. Crowds began to gather in front of my house, throwing stones and shouting vile accusations, calling me a sinner, a prostitute. They hurled so many insults that I couldn't bear to leave my home anymore. I don't understand why this is happening to me when I am innocent. I have done nothing wrong. The woman broke down into sobs again. The king turned his piercing gaze toward the 4 men, who shifted uncomfortably under his scrutiny. Finally, one of them stammered, "Your Majesty, this woman is lying. None of what she says is true. She is deceitful and immoral. She is a sinner and should be stoned to death." The 4 men echoed this accusation, repeating the same arguments with rising fervor. Meanwhile, the king's eyes fell upon the dog, lying loyally at the woman's feet. The king rose from his seat and approached the animal. Kneeling, he gently stroked its back and addressed the court. "You claim that this woman is immoral and that she has committed acts with this dog. If this is true, then let the dog itself reveal the truth. It will speak today by Allah's command and expose whether this accusation is true or false." The court erupted in murmurs of disbelief. The idea seemed absurd to everyone present, and the 4 men stared at the king in shock. One of them finally protested, "Your Majesty, how can this be? This is just a dumb animal. It cannot speak." The king fixed the man with a stern gaze and replied, "When pious and innocent people are wrongfully accused, Allah sends His divine intervention, and today He will surely send His help to this animal, allowing it to speak and prove its owner's innocence." Turning back to the dog, the king stroked its back again and said, "O speechless creature, today your owner is in great distress. You are the only one who can prove her innocence and free her from these false accusations. By Allah's will, speak and declare your owner's innocence. Tell us if she has ever wronged you." The court fell silent. All eyes were on the dog as the king's words hung in the air. Suddenly, the dog barked loudly, its voice echoing through the hall. The murmurs in the court grew louder as the dog barked continuously. Though its speech was incomprehensible to the people, the king commanded, "If these men are guilty, attack them and prove your owner's innocence." The dog immediately sprang to life, charging at the 4 men. It tore at their clothes, growling ferociously. Terrified, the men shouted in panic and finally confessed their guilt, crying out, "Your Majesty, we are the sinners! We lied and falsely accused this woman of wrongdoing." One of the men, dressed in white, stepped forward trembling. His clothing, now shredded by the dog, hung in tatters. He admitted, "Your Majesty, it was all a lie. These 3 men came to me and said this woman was extraordinarily beautiful. One of them saw her face by chance one day when her veil was lifted by the wind. Her radiant beauty drove him mad, and he began harassing her daily, inviting her to commit sin. But she always refused him, and he could not bear her rejection. Upon hearing the full truth, the king stood and declared the woman innocent in the grand court, restoring her honor. The 4 men, however, were sentenced to death. As punishment, they were stoned publicly and then executed. Their desperate pleas for mercy fell on deaf ears as the king upheld his judgment, ensuring justice was served. This incident stands as a testament to the fact that Allah protects His pious and innocent servants from false accusations, no matter the circumstances. May Allah grant us protection from evil and guide us always. Ameen.